Hello, and welcome to the Gravel Ride Podcast. I'm your host, Craig Dalton. I'm excited to announce this week's podcast is brought to you by our friends at Athletic Greens. You may remember Athletic Greens from our time in 2020, and I'm super stoked they're joining us again in 2021. It's a product I've been using for the last, it must be at least 3 years. Kind of post-cancer, I recognized that I simply wasn't covering my nutritional bases every day, and I investigated multivitamins, and it just wasn't something that resonated with me. I discovered Athletic Greens actually through another podcast, and it was a bit of a leap of faith. I hadn't tried a product like this, and maybe I'm gun shy of investing in my health, which seems crazy for me to articulate. But at the end of the day, I decided now was the time. I'm getting older. I just turned 50, and it was critical that I started getting all the vitamins and minerals that the body needs. The product has over 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients that are blended together in this green powder that you just mix with water. My personal process is I take 3 ice cubes. I like it cold. I find it tastes best then. And I shake it up every day when I get a chance, whether it's in the morning or in the afternoon. And I just drink it. It's easy. It gives me zinc for better muscle recovery and better sleep, magnesium for nervous system recovery and sleep, high dosage of vitamin C. I also take a vitamin D supplement from Athletic Greens, which comes in an eyedropper, and it's just a couple drops. Actually, 1 drop a day gives you more than twice, I think, the amount of vitamin D that is recommended by doctors, which is a great way to kind of keep yourself safe. I also, a couple years ago, learned that Athletic Green is NSF certified for sport, which means they take the product seriously. They're consistently testing it and auditing it to make sure what is on the label is actually in the pouch. And that's what enables them to have a relationship with USA Cycling and Olympic athletes, because they know this product is pure and they don't have to worry about anything slipping into the ingredients list. Anyway, it means a ton that our friends at Athletic Greens are back for 2021. The only way they see value in this relationship, obviously, is if you guys go and check it out. So if you could just visit athleticgreens.com/thegravelride, check out the options there, see if it's right for you. And if it is, definitely hit me up. I'd love to hear your feedback. Like I said, this relationship with Athletic Greens personally dates way back before the podcast, and it's something that I invest in every day for my own personal health. So big thanks to our friends at Athletic Greens. This week on the podcast, we've got Patrick Carey, one of the coaches at Speed Science Coaching out of New York. In the Ridership Forum, there was a conversation about the skills required for gravel cycling and how someone, whether they're coming from road or mountain, what are the 5 skills that they really need to acquire to excel at gravel cycling? Patrick jumped into that conversation on the forum and offered a few tips, and I thought it would be great to have him break it down in his own words. There are some videos on the Speed Science Coaching YouTube channel that'll give you a sense of some of the positioning things we're talking about, because I know that can be tricky to visualize when you're just hearing him talk about it. But I thought it was great to offer the listener just sort of a primer on the things you can work on. I love the suggestion of getting into a flat, grassy field and just kind of working through some of this stuff, because a lot of times when you're out there on a gravel ride, things are coming at you fast and furious, and it's hard to kind of break down the technique. So going out there and practice, something which is pretty common, I think, in the cyclocross crowd, is important to improving your gravel cycling skill set in general. So with that, let's dive right into my conversation with Patrick Carey. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Hey, Greg, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you. It's interesting. You and I met back at Sea Otter in 2019, which seems like ages ago, but have also reconnected in the Ridership Forum. So it's great to sort of get you on the mic and have the listener learn a thing or two about you and get into this great discussion about gravel cycling skills.
Yeah, I'm really excited for that.
So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. I've been riding seriously / competitively for a bit over 20 years. I've done a little bit of everything from a lot of road racing, and as a junior, some triathlon, and now, probably the bulk of my time has been focused on mountain bike and cyclocross. And then the last couple of years, really enjoying gravel as well.
Nice. And you've got a coaching business as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's my full-time profession. We've been going strong since 2013. So it's called Speed Science Coaching. And we work with all manners of endurance athletes, but we really specialize in cyclists and multi-sport athletes.
Nice. And some of the conversation in the Ridership Forum that I picked up on, it was great seeing you offering advice on technique as well as training. And the conversation that was going on from a newer gravel cyclist was asking, what are the skills as a road cyclist coming to gravel that I really need to focus on? So I thought it'd be awesome if I could get you to break down, say, like the top 5 skills you think a gravel cyclist needs to master in order to maximize their performance.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And let's also recognize too that whether you're coming from a road background or a mountain bike, gravel's just a little bit of a different beast, especially if you're riding on, say, a gravel specific bike. So really this will apply to anybody who's new to that type of riding. I would even put myself in that category. I've been riding a long time, and I really only started riding gravel seriously back in like 2018, 2019. So yeah, it's this neat blending of a lot of different skills and a lot of different attributes of riding.
Yeah, it's so fascinating kind of looking at it from the listener's perspective. I'm sure many of you out there come from a road background, but some will also come from a mountain bike background. And as you said, you're going to bring different skill sets to gravel. And there's going to be things, honestly, that you may have to unlearn when you get on the gravel bike and riding off-road. But certainly plenty of things you can learn and modify that are going to make you a better gravel cyclist.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say actually probably a better cyclist in general too. You can take those to the other disciplines. And some of the keys, really, like you hit the nail on the head as far as there's a few things to unlearn here and there, and we'll touch on those as we go through. But there's habits that we build up, especially when we're road riding, that don't really serve us when we get into bumpier terrain or loose terrain. So I think that'll make a big difference for folks.
Yeah, and the other thing you highlighted, which I think is important to note, is that gravel cycling means so many different things to so many people, depending on where you are in the world. So that's going to be something that'll be a theme as a listener listens to what we're talking about. If you're just riding on gravel roads, you just may be concerned about, sliding out in a corner and different techniques around that, whereas navigating a rock garden is not really in your worldview of gravel cycling.
Yeah, it's true. But I would say, like the thing I love about gravel riding and riding that type of bike is that you can mix all of that terrain into one kind of ride. So like from our house, we'll oftentimes, we live on a paved road, but we'll, within a mile, we can get into dirt roads, and we'll take those into unimproved dirt roads, and then we hook them over into some mountain bike single track, and then loop back through all of that stuff. So it's once you get some of these skills under your belt, the world kind of becomes your oyster. You can ride that bike just about anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of those lessons, as we talked about offline about the pandemic. It's just this idea that you can ride out on your favorite local road and then see a footpath or a trail off to the side, and with a proper gravel bike, you can go and explore it.
Absolutely. I mean, that was the eye opener for me. The first ride I went out on a proper gravel bike is, I don't have to ride past those things anymore. Like if you were on a mountain bike, you were kind of focused on trails. If you were on a road bike, you'd be riding past all those great things and going, geez, like I wonder what's up there. Now you don't have to wonder. You get to go explore them.
That's exactly it. So let's jump into our sort of top 5 tips for what riders should be thinking about as they're building their skill set.
Sounds good. All right. So the first one I would kind of classify as floating through rough terrain. So this is one that's really going to apply for the road rider who's getting into gravel. And, the biggest difference you're going to see is that, you're not riding on a smooth paved road anymore. It's got bumps, it's got holes, it's got potentially, square edged things that you need to hop over to, avoid smacking your wheels on. So I think the easiest way to describe this is getting comfortable with bike body separation. So, when we ride on the road, we're almost always sitting on the saddle or we're standing up to pedal, but we don't often get into the kind of float mode where we're hovering above the saddle and, we're keeping our weight ideally on our feet as opposed to our hands. But, this ability to separate your bike and body allows that bike. Most gravel bikes don't have suspension, so we want to allow that bike to float under us. And if you're talking about, the allowing, say, a 20-pound bike to move around under you, that's a lot different than the bike plus you having to move as one unit. And the biggest thing that gives you is it gives you the ability to smooth things out and also to relax, right? If you're getting popped around, if you're tense and hanging on for dear life, what ends up happening is every bump that the bike hits you as well, and so now you're getting pushed up and down, left and right. So just being able to be comfortable hovering out of the saddle, being this is where a dropper post makes a difference when we get onto descents. Getting yourself a little bit of room so that bike can naturally move around. It's been described as like getting into the attack position, right, where you're crouching with bent knees, bent elbows, and that way, you're allowing yourself to provide some natural suspension for the bike.
Yeah, I think this is one that the athlete gets a lot of feedback immediately as soon as they go off road. You're spot on. When you're on your road bike, you may spend an entire hour sitting in the saddle pedaling at your proper cadence. But off-road, you don't have that luxury. And as I said, fortunately, the bike is going to give you that feedback initially. And it's just important to acknowledge, okay, if I can get that little bit of space between my bottom and the saddle, the bike can move as you described, and the hits are going to come a lot fewer and certainly a lot harsher to the body, which is it adds up over time if you're taking a lot of body abuse.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And if you figure, mile after mile on, say, either a washboard surface or even just a single, bumpy descent, you can go from, if you're doing this right, you can be totally relaxed and feeling good at the bottom. Or, if you are, tensed up, your arms are going to be just about cramping at the bottom of that descent. So, yeah, it makes a big, big difference.
And for me, you mentioned droppers, and I certainly won't get on my soapbox about the value of a dropper post, but I will say when you're on a sustained descent, something where you're not going to be back on the saddle, you're not going to be in that perfect pedaling position at all, being able to move the saddle down and give that buffer, a little bit more buffer, allows the bike to navigate the bumps and have space to kind of hop up and down without jamming you up.
Absolutely. I have a dropper on my gravel bike. I think it makes a world of difference. And so something I found over the years with coming from mountain biking, when you ride, say, like a big enduro bike, something with a lot of travel, it makes sense to have a lot of dropper post. But what people got hung up on was they said, oh, geez, like on a cross-country bike, I don't need that. But I found over the years that the less travel a bike has in its suspension, the more a dropper post helps. And if you think of most gravel bikes, all but one I can think of, or two, there is no suspension. So, it's giving yourself that extra travel, both it allows you to get into a lower crouch, but it also allows you, as you said, room to pull the bike up. You can do that simple style like roadie hop, bunny hop to just yank the bike up over holes or over a bump. Makes a big difference.
Yeah, and the interesting thing I discovered, many people think of the dropper post as being a binary thing. You're either up or you're down. But the reality is all these posts have range. So I often find myself lowering it just slightly in places where I'm going to be doing more pedaling than descending, for example. And even that creates just a lot more freedom to throw the bike around.
It really does. Yeah, it really does.
Yeah. So enough dropper post prophesizing. I know I'm stuck on it, so I have to be conscious to move away that it doesn't make sense for everybody. So that's a great tip, floating through the rough travel. What would you say is your second tip?
All right, so the next one is turning, and again, this is one that is going to matter a lot to the road rider. The biggest difference when you're talking about turns on gravel versus paved road is the traction difference, right? So on a paved road, you can get away with a lot of things because you have generally very good traction. And I think sometimes that leads to building some bad habits, where people are, they're not necessarily cornering with technique, more they're just getting through them, but they can get through them pretty well. When you start taking away the traction, all of a sudden, it's a different ball of wax. So let's just preface this by saying also that over a certain speed, which I figure somewhere in the 5 to 7 mile an hour range, you can't really steer the bike by turning the bars. When you're doing that and the traction is not very good, that leads to the front wheel trying to plow in a straight line and the dreaded front wheel slip out. So we need to get comfortable with the idea of leaning the bike. But where it's different from riding on pavement is we need to lean the bike without leaning ourselves. And there's two reasons for that. One, we're trying to get as much weight as we can on the outside of the bike, specifically the outside pedal, right? We want to get that pedal generally down to the bottom and just stomp on it with all of our weight. So now our weight is basically, if you lean the bike over, you now put the weight in line with your tires. But the key part also is you're making your weight in a place that if the bike starts to slide, which it's gravel, it's going to slide from time to time, you want the bike to slide under you so that you're staying in balance. If you're leaning your shoulders and your upper body into a turn like you would more on a road bike, if that bike slips out, you're going to basically fall to the inside and you're going to take away any weight that was on your tires. So it's, this is something that would be much more akin to, how a mountain bike racer would corner. But I think it's also, if you look at like the best cyclocross racers, that's how they would be turning because they're always cornering at the limit of the traction of their tires. So I think that's just really, it's important to recognize that, if we don't change that, we're going to be extremely speed limited in how we can go through turns. And then also with that, when things aren't going how you want them to in a turn, like let's say you came in a little too hot, right? And now you're going, like I might not make this turn. That's the case of where like committing to that lean and committing to not wrestling with your handlebars, like trying to wrestle to steer them a bit more by actually turning the front wheel. That's where you're going to ensure that you can help the bike get around that turn. When we start to say tense up or, get on the brakes in that turn, we're going to do one of two things. We're either going to slide our wheels out or we're going to make the bike want to stand up, kind of just like would happen to a motorcycle. If you get on the brakes on a motorcycle in the turn, you stand it up and you almost guarantee that you don't make the turn. So it's just really important to get comfortable with that feeling of, getting into that proper position of leaning the bike, standing ourselves up almost straight up and down over that outside pedal. And then if things aren't going well, don't freak out. Like be patient, let the bike come through the turn, and you're almost guaranteed it's going to come through.
Yeah, it's something that I had the privilege of getting coached on a downhill bike in Whistler, and it was not at all how I sort of learned or heard how you turn on the road. So it's fascinating to kind of get up over the bike while you're leaning the bike itself and not your body over the bike.
Yeah, and so there's a really easy drill that you can do for this. And actually, we have a video on the Speed Science Coaching YouTube channel showing this for a mountain bike, but it's the same idea for a gravel bike or even a cyclocross bike. And basically, what you can do to practice is Let's say you want to practice leaning the bike to the right. So you're going to stand up and put all of your weight on the left pedal. So the left pedal will be down, and then just shift the bars to the side to lean the bike without moving the rest of your body. And so what will happen is the bike is hinging over, and you're keeping your weight on the outside pedal. And if you were to look at your tires too, that's an important thing to recognize, is that oftentimes we're riding very minimalist tires on a gravel bike, but most of those tires are going to have some kind of cornering knob more significant than whatever's in the middle of the tread. By leaning the bike over, we're maximizing the hookup of that cornering tread. And it's something that's very obvious on a mountain bike tire, those big blocky cornering knobs. But, we have much smaller but still very useful cornering knobs on a gravel tire.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think turning is something that the listener needs to take slowly and build the skills around. The other variable, obviously, is that we're not always going to be on hard packed dirt. Depending on where you are in the country, we could have, loose gravel on top of it or rocks, and the bike behaves very differently in those situations. And the best way I can sort of describe it is I've always thought about sort of putting things in the bank, the visual bank about things I've ridden over in the past. And as I'm entering a turn or any section for that matter, I'm scanning my mind for experiences that look similar to what I'm about to approach, and I can adjust the technique accordingly. Obviously, if it's loose gravel and you go in with a super lean, you're going to slide out. So you've got to make some adjustments based on your speed and your technique as you address different types of cornering situations.
Absolutely. And I think key there too is with that mental bank, you're building a reference for what speed can you go into something with. And that's key. And my recommendation would be, work your way up. Like, don't just go bombing into turns and hope for the best. Like, work your way up in speed, so that you can safely find, where your comfortable limits are. But you're also you're going to build good habits much easier than if you are having bad experiences. Bad experiences usually lead to us then riding much more tense, much more cautious. And unfortunately, that becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're riding tense and cautious, you're actually getting in the way of the bike. You might start wrestling with the steering. You might be more apt to brake in a turn. So, build up that, like you said, that library, but build it up incrementally, and conservatively.
Yeah. And obviously we ride. Where we ride these gravel bikes, there is absolutely twists and turns all over the place. So if you can build up this skill set, you will find that when you're out riding with friends or on a group ride, those skills will pay big dividends in your ability to keep up with people and do it safely and comfortably.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So turning, another great tip. What's your third tip?
Okay, so somewhat related, which would be braking, right? And related very much in the sense that we're braking on less than perfect traction, and also maybe dealing with bumps as we are. So I think it's super important to learn to really use our brakes independently. So this is something I work on all the time when I work one-on-one with athletes for skills, and because it almost, I used to think that it was certain disciplines built certain habits, but now I see it's pretty universally. People aren't super aware of what each brake does for them, and and how to modulate them independently. So the most important thing to the principle here is that on the less than stellar traction that we sometimes have on gravel. Probably 70, maybe even up to 80% of our braking traction is going to come from our front wheel.
Yeah, and I think that's going to blow a few people's mind if you let that sit in, that 70 or 80% of your braking power could come from the front brake.
Yeah, and so when I teach that to folks, oftentimes, there's a little bit of disbelief there. So what I'll do, I'll have them we'll set up either cones or a painted box, and have them ride at it at a very good clip, and then using, say, either only their back brake or only their front brake, try and stop inside that box. And what you find is when you do only the back brake and you grab a handful of it, you're instantly skidding that back tire. And, to the point where you just about feel like you're accelerating once you do it, but you're certainly not scrubbing any speed. And when you do it with your front tire, as long as you're shifting your weight back, which really means just shifting your hips back on the bike as you do it, you can stop on a dime with your front brake. A lot of us now, most, it's probably safe to say almost all bikes, that are out on the gravel world are riding disc brakes. But even if you're not, it's the same principle. But I mentioned disc brakes because we get all of this power out of them, but we get modulation as well, which we didn't really have with the rim brakes.
Yeah, I think when we, as cyclists growing up, someone along the way has told you, don't grab your front brake, you're going to flip over the handlebars.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the truth is, like, if you, and I would encourage the listener to do this, find a flat section in a field, set up a couple objects so and get a sense for it, because it does take a lot of bad things to happen for you to flip over your handlebar by grabbing that front brake. If, as you said, if you shift your hips back, because the bike, you're going to have the weight to keep it down.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And when we're now in the modern world with these disc brakes, it used to be when you were running, V brakes or cantilever brakes, what would end up happening is if you did have enough leverage to have power, it was kind of like an on-off switch for your tire, for your wheel spinning. With the disc brake, you have modulation, so you can go almost to that point of locking up and stopping the wheel, but you can then feather it just shy of that point. And that idea of modulation is really important too, because as I said, we're going to get 3/4 or more of our braking power out of the front, but we don't want the back to just be along for the ride. We might as well get something out of that. But the drill that I mentioned, as far as learning to use those brakes independently, learning what each one does, that's the idea of teaching to use your front brake as your default for most of the power, and then get comfortable, feathering that rear brake on to get more to help it. And then also, once you start to learn what your brakes do, you can start to apply them in different places. So, like I mentioned, braking in a turn is generally not a great idea. When we're coming into a turn, we want to set our speed when the bike is upright, hopefully when we have better traction. But then when we're into the turn, we want to be generally off the brakes. But if we have to slow down, there can be times when, either you're still on a steep downhill, and so you're still getting pulled by gravity, or you're just coming in a little too hot for what comes next. That's where the back brake starts to be your friend. And in the motorcycle world and others, they call it trail braking, where you're using your trailing wheel to help slow you down. And if the back brake, let's say you got a little too heavy on it in a turn, worst thing that happens is your back tire slides a little bit. That's not that big of a deal. It's a lot better than your front wheel sliding out on you. And also the back brake, the back wheel is going to be far less likely to stand the bike up and fight you in the turn.
Right. Yeah, I think braking is another one of those things that, as a newer athlete, you just need to go out and practice these things and get the feel. And then once you get the feel on the flat ground, then as you apply it to your descents, you can start figuring out and testing and trying different techniques to try to find the right combination for any section that you're approaching.
Absolutely. And I think that key is really important to practice. When I work with athletes on skills, we don't just go start, say, on a piece of single track or out on a gravel road. We start in a park or in a bike park. And the reason is we're trying to remove some of the complexity and just allow to practice a specific skill. And it makes a huge difference to be able to learn and acquire those skills. You're far more able to experiment, right? Because if something doesn't go right, you're on grass, or you're not bombing down some big descent. or on a narrow trail. So, and also, certainly there's no traffic around. We want to learn these things in a safe place, but we really want to spend time practicing. And it can even be as simple as, go, at the end of a ride, practice something in your front yard, or stop at the park on the way home, practice for 10 minutes. If you do that a couple times a week, it really adds up.
Yeah, it is. You understand, skidding can be fun in the right environment. And it's a great skill to understand. You want to understand when you're going to make your bike skid out, what type of application of the brake is going to cause that, and how to handle it when it does. Because the last thing you want to do is be surprised when you're legitimately out there on a ride. Yeah, great tip. So that's braking number 3. Let's move on to number 4.
All right. So the next one is climbing. So, the reason I bring this up is, there's a super common theme here, which is, right, there's bumps and mixed traction when you get onto gravel. And, that really shows up when we get onto climbs. And I think, it's worth pointing out too, that oftentimes on gravel roads and trails, you're going to be going up something much steeper than you would be used to going up on a paved road. So, learning to manage your traction as you're climbing is a really important skill, and it can make the difference between something being, rideable versus unrideable, and or just being really frustrating when you're watching other people go up it and you just cannot. Most of the time, it's not often a strength limiter for folks. It's technique becomes huge when you're talking about going up a steep, loose climb. So something that I borrow on pretty heavily from the cyclocross world is the idea of shifting up a gear or two more than you would normally ride a climb in. And, I'm a big fan of spinning when you can, spinning a nice high cadence. But when you're spinning and the traction is not great, especially if there's bumps, it's very easy for you to, on that downstroke, that power stroke of your pedaling, if you happen to slip right then in a small gear, zip, you'll very quickly turn that into a full spin out. There's 2 reasons that cyclocross riders ride in a bigger gear. One is they get a little more traction out of it, and if their wheel slips, it's not the end of that pedal stroke. They get more travel out of it, and it allows them to suspend their body slightly above the saddle because they're pushing with more torque on the pedals. And that's another thing that makes a big difference is getting out of the saddle, like being willing to get out of the saddle and move around on the bike, even on a climb. Usually what ends up happening for road riders is it's kind of a binary thing. They're either sitting on the saddle, spinning or even churning away, at a low cadence, but they're either sitting or they stand up and move forward on the bike to get that extra power or even just a change of position. But what ends up happening is if those are your only 2 positions when you're climbing, you're missing that key one, which is in between where you're hovering on the bike and you're trying to keep yourself pretty balanced between the wheels. I'm sure you've seen, Craig, some of the roads and trails you go on, and certainly some of the famous events, they have these super steep climbs where if you are too far back on the bike, you're probably lifting your front wheel off the ground, or if you're getting too forward, you're spinning out.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. One of the things you mentioned, which I think is very true, is just as road riders come into off-road climbs, there's a sense of frustration in many cases because their forward progress is disrupted by the natural obstacles of rocks and roots and things they're going over. And it can be very disconcerting. I know many a road cyclist who has come out with me who are far superior athletically and power-wise to myself, but I can easily ride away from them off-road because at this point I'm just not disturbed by the fact that my bike is moving around because of rocks and roots. I know how to adapt my pedal stroke. Maybe I'm up a gear, as you said, so that I can just go through it. And it's a shift in mindset as well as technique in my observation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one thing that popped in my mind just then too was, being willing or able to ratchet the pedals here and there. Let's say now you're faced with either, an extra steep little huff to get up over an obstacle, or, you're actually having to lift your wheels to get over a ledge. That's where, it's very common for mountain bikers to ratchet their pedals so they're not having to go all the way around again before they get another downstroke. They'll push down and then pull their foot back up to get right back on the power for that little burst. And it also prevents them from having their foot down as they're going over an obstacle that might snag their pedal or their foot.
Yeah, and I think for the mountain biker, and this certainly applies to gravel as well, there are moments when you're tackling an obstacle where the bike will stop all forward motion entirely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the best athletes have an understanding that that's going to happen. And as you said, you need to then apply a little bit more power to the pedal to ratchet over something and then start going again. If you wear your roadie hat, how often do we ever stop the road bike? Save like stopping for a stop sign or something like that. You're never coming to a complete standstill as part of your route and then starting again without unclipping.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to get comfortable with that. Practice doing track stands. Practice being able to, and if you can't do a track stand yet, practice just riding from point A to point B as absolutely slow as you can, and get comfortable with being able to, oftentimes you have to make a very quick shift with your weight to keep the bike in balance during those times. But it makes a huge difference to be comfortable with those momentary stalls, without that meaning, oh, now I have to unclip.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe in your braking exercise that we talked about earlier, when you come to that complete stop, see if you can just sort of take a breath, take a beat, completely stopped, and then start your bike again. Because that's the basics of what we're trying to describe. And what you really need to learn is that idea that you can be completely stopped, still in your pedals, and you can restart again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So now we've talked about climbing as tip number 4. We're up the mountain. What are we going to do now? What's tip 5?
Yeah, so tip 5, right? What goes up must come down. So descending. And this is somewhat of a catch-all for a lot of the things we've talked about because you need to be able to navigate the bumps. You need to be able to oftentimes hop over things. That's another thing I would definitely work on practicing. And there's 2 styles of bunny hop, and I think on a gravel bike they're both very useful. So there's what, for lack of a better term, I call the roadie hop, which is where you lunge your body up and then pull your feet and hands up to suck the bike up. That's the kind of thing that most people would be relatively comfortable doing on the road if, say, there was a pothole they had to hop. That's really handy, at higher speeds on a gravel bike because you don't have to get very high over something and you're going to have enough hang time to clear it. But also, depending on how chunky the terrain you're going to ride is, I think it's very helpful to work on more of like a mountain bike or cyclocross style hop. Another thing that we have on our Speed Science coaching YouTube page, we have some tutorials on hopping. Those they're demonstrated on a mountain bike, but the technique is exactly the same for a gravel bike. If you're going for a proper high bunny hop, and then I'll bait you a little bit, Craig, with the dropper post again, because this is where I think dropper posts shine. I use my dropper post constantly, and the thing I find interesting, I'm so used to using it. I now use it on paved descents as well, and I find I'm able to ride those descents faster and more comfortably than if the seat was up. It really, I know there are holdouts, but I can tell you that if you get used to riding one and you incorporate it into your riding, it makes a massive difference. And I think one of the keys that oftentimes if someone's tried it and didn't like it, oftentimes the difference is that they had a remote to actuate it that was not easy to reach from where they normally ride their hands. So you see a lot of people riding a dropper post with a remote. They have to say, go to the middle of the bars or, and push with their thumb. That's a step that you're not going to do when things are starting to hit the fan. So it's much easier if you have a one bike, convert the left shifter to do it, or put a remote in the bend of the drop, and then all of a sudden it becomes this tool that you can use at any time.
Patrick, now you done gone winded me up again about dropper
I know.
No, I'm seriously, I am with you. Like road descending, like for the roadie out there, and maybe there's not a lot of them listening, but if you can remove the saddle from being high in the pocket and have a little bit more room down there to lean the bike, it is absolutely game changing from a confidence perspective. And honestly, as you said, like if you've got a well set up dropper post, to me, the only objection that is valid is that it's adding some extra weight. And I do get that people can be weight conscious on these pieces of equipment. But for me, like I'll take that weight any day, time you offer it to me, because what I've found overwhelmingly is that I can outperform people without dropper posts, regardless of skill level, 9 times out of 10. Because I just have that big of a equipment advantage underneath me.
Yeah, and if so the weight weenie folks, I'll appeal to their competitiveness. So you watch people in road races doing the super tuck position, right, where they get basically on the top tube and their butt is under the saddle. It is so dangerous, and should only be performed. There's an argument to be made that it shouldn't, and nobody should be doing it. But when you push a dropper post down, you now have a super tuck position, but you're on top of the saddle, so it's super safe.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. It is game changing. So we'll leave it at that. So we've been through our 5 tips. So is there anything as we've been talking that you're thinking, hey, I gotta mention this?
Yeah. So I think there's 2 things that come to mind. The first one is sand riding. And this is a little bit different than the fact that we're riding on gravel or loose terrain. This is if you're faced with those honest to goodness like sand pits, the really loose deep sand. This is something that I think almost no matter what discipline you're coming from, except for some cyclocross racers, depending on what the courses in their region are like. Most people just don't get exposed to deep sand riding. And I know it can be downright frustrating for folks to figure out how to navigate it. So, I think the easiest way I can put it is we really need to not be steering our bikes or, putting in big steering inputs here, because that's where the wheel is the sand is going to catch that wheel and it's going to try to keep that turn going. So you'll just end up in a wrestling match of overcorrection with the steering. It's another case where shifting into a higher gear makes all the difference in the world. We do not want to be trying to spin in sand. It's the biggest reason being that we want that extra torque on the pedals. We want that extra torque on the wheels to help keep the bike relatively upright. And it also, that's another case where it allows us to, by having that extra torque on the pedals, we can be hovering, even if it's just an inch above the saddle. When you watch like really high level cyclocross racers going through the sand, they look like they're sitting squarely on the seat, but they're not. They're actually hovering slightly. And that's allowing the bike to make these micro movements under them without it becoming like a big macro movement that takes them with it. And I think also, really making sure that you are, look for ruts where they exist, and don't try and fight it if you find yourself in one. That's one of those cases where you really have to go with the rut. But also, be looking at the terrain that's coming, to try and plot a general route through, as opposed to, okay, I'm going to put my wheel exactly here and exactly here. You have to go with the sand quite a bit more. Yeah.
You talk about steering, and I always think about it on sand. The front wheel is going to move around. You're going to get a lot of feedback in your handlebar, and you, as you said, you cannot wrestle it. You don't want to be on the front brake. I always tend to put my weight a little bit further back to keep the front end light, because I don't want to get my tire bogged down into any bit of the sand. And it's a very disconcerting type of terrain to ride through, particularly if you haven't done it before. And even when you have, I tell you, there was, as in my stay down in Topanga the last couple of months, there was a section at the end of a long fire road downhill where I could get a lot of speed. And it was probably 100-foot section of sand. And every time I went through it, I was quite terrified, knowing that, I was going to hit it with speed, but I needed to just let the bike move where it was going to move and generally keep myself upright over the machine, and I would get through it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, attacking it a little bit, as far as being willing to generate and keep your momentum up, that makes a big difference. But then at the same time being relaxed and letting that bike move, it's finding that balance between the two.
Yeah. The good news is if sand is where you choose to crash, it's probably the most favorable place to crash.
Yes. Yeah. Usually you're not hitting rocks and such as you come down.
Exactly. Anything else you wanted to share on tips?
Yeah. So I think the last thing would be, like learning to look ahead further, really using your vision to plot a course for where you're headed. Especially if you're used to riding on the road, you can get away with looking just about anywhere most of the time, as long as you see what's coming, before you get there. On the mountain bike, people, this is almost a cliche now, look ahead, look where you want to go. But I find that people still, especially just because mountain bike speeds are oftentimes a little lower, they tend to look sort of a fixed distance in front of them, maybe 30 feet or so. I think the best way to do it, and this is actually what I teach riders, regardless of what discipline they're in, is to scan their eyes. So, maybe spend 70% of the time looking way up ahead, so that that's how you're keeping things from being a surprise, and then that the rest of that 30% of the time. Scan your eyes back closer, so that you can make the micro adjustments in your course. And then also, one of my absolute all-time favorite events is the Vermont Overland. It's a race that, it has a little bit of pavement, a ton of gravel, and then they have these they call them Vermont pave sections, which is essentially like a really gnarly four-wheel drive road. Nothing you could drive even in a stock pickup truck. And now we're taking gravel bikes through these things, and the folks that do the best in them are able to look ahead and plot their course long before they get to each feature. So that way they're setting themselves up to say, be on the correct side of the road for the thing that they want to navigate, or if they have to, cross and get over to the other side. But that idea of that vision, making sure you're planning ahead a little bit, makes a massive difference, because the last thing you want to do is be surprised by a hole you didn't see, or some ledge that comes up that you didn't know was there, or as big as you hoped it would be.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I mean, a lot of people will have acquired some of these skills and mindset through downhill skiing or snowboarding, where it's it's so important to look ahead. And similarly, as you're addressing a new obstacle with your bike, you need to be able to make adjustments to your speed, your line, etc., well in advance of these obstacles, if you're going to be able to continue with the great momentum. So I find like the best athletes, momentum is king, and they're doing everything they can to make adjustments to keep their momentum going, whether it's, powering down through a flat into a rise so they don't have to pedal the entire hill on the way up, or adjusting their line to have the smoothest course through a rock garden. All of these things add up, and you see the big difference between the high performing riders versus the newer riders.
Yeah, absolutely. But the cool thing is, all of these skills, everything we mentioned here can be learned very easily. Like, none of these, I wouldn't classify any of these as advanced skills. These are things that anybody can start working in with a little bit of practice. And I think you hit it on the head, like having that mindset, right? The mindset of planning where you're going, the mindset of keeping your momentum up, makes all the difference.
Yeah. Well, these were great tips. I will have all of them documented in the show notes. I'll have a link to the Speed Science website. I'll have a link to your YouTube channel so people can visualize some of the exercises and techniques and the body positioning that you've talked about, because, in many ways it can be difficult hearing in your ears and translating this to the bike. But I think the bottom line is riders just need to get out and go through exercises to train themselves in these techniques. And those exercises are not out on your local ride. It's something very specific and intentional.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, either doing it with, a friend or even on your own, it makes a difference because, if you're trying to practice things on rides, there's always the element of that you have to keep up, right? And you have to, you're not going to do quite the same disciplined practice. But, and also if you're doing it by yourself, set your phone up, to film you, and you'll be amazed at what oftentimes is the difference between what you think you're doing and what you're actually doing. When I'm working with athletes one-on-one, I'm constantly using my phone as a tool, filming and then showing them in slow motion. So, they can see if I move my body in this way, all of a sudden I unlock that skill.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Patrick, it was a real pleasure talking to you, and I appreciate all the tips, and I hope for the listener, they're getting a lot out of it and will take their riding to the next level here in 2021.
Yeah, make it your year.
So big thanks to Patrick for sharing all those great tips with you. I hope you learned as much as I did in that conversation, and I appreciate you spending a little time with us this week. If you're interested in connecting with Patrick, you can certainly hit up the speedscience.com website to learn more about him and his coaching services, as well as the YouTube channel that we referenced. He's also an active participant in the Ridership Forum, where you can join at www.theridership.com. It's been amazing to see the Ridership Forum grow so quickly and the quality of daily interactions just accelerate so rapidly. It's fun connecting with others online. The goal of the forum is pretty simple. We want to create a global resource for gravel and adventure cycling enthusiasts to connect, but also to connect in person. That's going to be a big push for us when we get through this pandemic, is building tools and resources so that riders can discover other riders and routes. So come on over to the Ridership. It's totally free to join. We'd love to have you. We've got riders from all over the world. And it's also a place where I'm gaining a lot of interesting ideas for future podcasts. So if you have recommendations there, you can hit me up directly within the forum via direct message. And we also have a sub-channel dedicated directly to the Gravel Ride podcast. So with all that said, thanks again for spending some time with us. That's it for this week. Until next time, here's to finding some dirt under your wheels.